Hello, and welcome to Blessed Sleep, where faith meets rest through the timeless wisdom of Scripture. Tonight, we will share the journey of a young shepherd named Eliam, a narrative inspired by Psalm 27, one of David's most powerful declarations of faith. This story explores the depths of human fear and the heights of divine courage, teaching us about unwavering trust in God's presence, even when our hearts tremble and our knees grow weak. It reveals how the Lord becomes our light in the darkest valleys, our stronghold when enemies surround us, and our confidence when everything within us wants to hide. As you listen, allow these faith-filled words to envelop you, bringing tranquility to your mind and renewal to your spirit. Let the gentle guidance of biblical wisdom lead you to a place of complete peace, resting in the presence of God. If this video blesses you, I would be deeply grateful if you could take a moment to like and subscribe to the channel. Your support enables me to continue sharing God's wisdom through these stories, creating more content designed to bring peace and spiritual refreshment through Scripture-inspired narratives. Now, take a deep breath, settle into the presence of God, and let us begin tonight's journey. Through this blessed story, the light came slowly to the hills of Judea, as it always did in those ancient days when the world was younger and the stars seemed closer to the earth. Dawn arrived not as a sudden burst, but as a gentle unfurling, like a scroll being opened by patient hands. First came the softening of the deepest darkness, a barely perceptible shift from black to the deepest blue. Then the eastern horizon began to glow with the faintest suggestion of amber, a promise whispered before it could be spoken aloud. The rocks that studded the hillsides, ancient and weathered, began to emerge from shadow, their shapes becoming solid again after a night of mystery. And with the light came the stirring of life, the small sounds that announced another day in the land where prophets walked and psalms were born. Eliam woke before the sun had fully shown its face, as was his custom. The young shepherd lay for a moment on his rough woolen blanket, feeling the cool morning air on his face and listening to the sounds of his small flock beginning to stir in the stone enclosure nearby. He could hear the soft bleating of the ewes calling to their lambs, the rustling of wool against stone as the animals rose and stretched. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster announced the morning with all the authority of a temple herald. The air smelled of dew on limestone, of wild thyme growing between the rocks, of wood smoke from the village below where families were beginning to kindle their cooking fires. These were the smells of home, the scents that had filled his nostrils since childhood, and yet this morning they brought him no comfort. His heart was troubled. It had been troubled for many days now, ever since the rumors had begun to spread through the villages like wind through dry grass. War was coming. The armies of a distant king were moving through the land, crushing everything in their path. The stories that reached Bethlehem spoke of villages burned, fields trampled, families scattered like chaff before the threshing floor. Some said the enemy would reach their region within a week. Others claimed they would arrive in days. A few brave souls insisted the threat was exaggerated, that the invaders would turn aside before reaching their hills. But Eliam had seen the fear in the eyes of the village elders, had heard the tremor in his father's voice when they spoke of it in the evening. The fear was real, and it had taken root in his chest like a stone, cold and heavy. He rose slowly, wrapping his outer cloak around his shoulders against the morning chill. His fingers automatically checked the leather strap that held his staff, the simple wooden rod that had been his grandfather's and his grandfather's before that. It was worn smooth by decades of use, darkened by the oils of countless hands. On his belt hung a small sling, the weapon he had practiced with since he was old enough to throw a stone. He was skilled with it now, could bring down a predator, threatening the flock from 40 paces. But what good was a sling against an army? What good was a shepherd's courage against trained warriors with bronze-tipped spears and shields that gleamed like the sun? The village of Bethlehem clung to its hillside like a collection of limestone cubes, each house built from the same pale stone that formed the bones of the earth itself. Narrow paths wound between the dwellings, worn smooth by generations of feet, both human and animal. The synagogue stood at the village center, its entrance facing toward Jerusalem, toward the holy city that lay a half-day's journey to the north. Even now, in these troubled times, men would gather there at dawn and dusk to pray, their voices rising in the ancient words that their fathers had taught them and their fathers before that, reaching back through time to Moses himself. Eliam's family lived in a modest house near the edge of the village, where the cultivated terraces gave way to the wilder pasture land. His father, Tobias, was a man of the Torah, a scribe who spent his days copying sacred texts with careful precision, his fingers stained with ink, his eyes squinting in the lamplight as he worked to preserve every letter, every stroke, knowing that the words he copied were words that God himself had spoken. His mother, Deborah, kept their home as women had kept homes since Sarah's time, grinding grain, baking bread, spinning wool from their small flock into thread. His younger sister, Hannah, was learning these skills, her small fingers growing nimble at the loom, her voice sweet when she sang the songs their mother had taught her. They were an ordinary family in an ordinary village, people of simple faith and honest work. They observed the Sabbath, kept the festivals, offered their sacrifices at the appointed times. They were not warriors. They were not soldiers. They were shepherds and scribes, weavers and farmers, people whose hands knew the feel of wool and parchment, not the weight of swords. And now war was coming to their doorstep, and Eliam felt something he had never truly felt before in his 17 years of life. He felt afraid, not the quick fear that comes when a wolf appears near the flock, the kind of fear that sharpens the senses and quickens the blood, that can be answered with action and then forgotten. This was different. This was the slow, creeping fear that comes in the night and stays through the day, that makes the bread taste like dust and steals the sweetness from the morning light. This was the fear that whispers in the quiet moments, "You are small, you are weak, you cannot stand against what is coming." He led his flock out as the sun finally broke free of the horizon, painting the hills in shades of gold and rose. The sheep knew the path, following it with the confidence of long habit, their hooves clicking softly on the stones. Eliam walked among them, staff in hand, but his mind was far from the peaceful work of shepherding. He found himself scanning the horizon constantly, looking for dust clouds that might signal approaching soldiers, listening for sounds that didn't belong to the morning symphony of birds and insects. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every distant figure made his heart quicken until it revealed itself as merely another shepherd or a farmer heading to his fields. The hill country of Judea was a landscape of contrasts, beautiful and harsh in equal measure. The valleys were green, where springs bubbled from the rock, creating small oases of fertility, where fig trees and olive groves could flourish. But the ridges were bare, exposing the pale bones of limestone that formed the skeleton of the land. In the clefts of the rocks, wild herbs grew, their fragrance released by the heat of the day. Thorn bushes clustered in the wadis, their branches twisted and gray. And everywhere there were stones, stones of every size, from pebbles to boulders, as if God had scattered them with a generous hand. It was in this land that David had tended his flocks a generation ago, before he became king. It was in these same hills that he had faced the lion and the bear, proving his courage before he ever stood before Goliath. The thought should have encouraged Eliam, but instead it made him feel smaller. David had been brave. David had been chosen. David had walked with God in a way that seemed impossible for an ordinary shepherd boy. By mid-morning, Eliam had led the flock to a place he loved, a small valley where a spring emerged from the rock face and created a pool before trickling away to join the larger seasonal stream below. Ancient oaks grew here, their roots finding purchase in the cracks of the stone, their branches spreading wide to create patches of precious shade. The grass was thick and sweet, and the sheep spread out to graze with satisfied bleating. Eliam sat on a flat rock near the spring, removing his leather water skin and taking a long drink. The water was cold and pure, tasting faintly of the minerals in the stone through which it had filtered. He splashed some on his face, feeling it run down his neck, momentarily washing away the dust and heat. It was here, in this quiet place, that he often came to think and pray. His father had taught him that God could be found anywhere, that the Almighty, who had made heaven and earth, was not confined to the temple in Jerusalem or even to the synagogue in Bethlehem, but that a man could speak to the Lord anywhere his heart was sincere. So Eliam often spoke to God here, sharing his thoughts as he might share them with a friend, though he wasn't always sure the Almighty was listening to one insignificant shepherd among the millions of souls in creation. Today, his prayer was simple and desperate. Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, he whispered, his words disappearing into the rustle of leaves and the murmur of water. I am afraid. The enemy comes, and I do not know what to do. My hands shake when I think of what may happen to my family, to our village, to the small ones who cannot defend themselves. Where will we go? How will we stand? I am not brave like David. I am not strong. I am just Eliam, son of Tobias, and I am afraid. The words hung in the air, and no answer came. The spring continued its quiet song. The sheep continued to graze. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermal currents with effortless grace. Everything continued as it always had, and Eliam felt foolish for expecting anything different. What was one boy's fear to the God who had parted the Red Sea and rained manna from heaven? What were his small troubles in the vast tapestry of all that existed? He picked up a smooth stone from beside the spring, turning it over in his palm, feeling its weight. This stone had been shaped by water over countless years, its rough edges worn away until it was perfectly smooth and round. Time and patience had transformed it. Perhaps, he thought, God worked the same way with human hearts, slowly wearing away the rough places, shaping them through circumstances they could not understand. But if that was true, what did it mean for the coming days? Would God allow the enemy to overrun them, to shape them through suffering? The thought brought no comfort. As the sun climbed higher, Eliam noticed an old man approaching along the path that skirted the valley. He was dressed in the simple robes of a traveler, dusty from the road, leaning heavily on a staff that was more necessity than ornament. His beard was long and white, his face deeply lined by sun and years, but his eyes were bright and alert, missing nothing as they swept across the landscape. He moved with the careful deliberation of age, but there was something in his bearing that suggested he had not always been old, that he carried within him the memory of strength and vigor. He raised a hand in greeting as he drew near, and Eliam, mindful of the sacred duty of hospitality that every child of Abraham learned from birth, rose to welcome him. "Peace be upon you, grandfather," Eliam called out, using the respectful title for any elderly man. "Will you rest here and share water from our spring? The day grows hot, and the shade is pleasant." The old man's face creased into a smile, transforming the landscape of wrinkles into something warm and inviting. "Peace be upon you, young shepherd," he replied, his voice surprisingly strong despite his apparent age. "Your kindness honors your father's house. I will gladly accept your offer." He made his way to the spring with measured steps, kneeling carefully to cup the water in his weathered hands and drink deeply. Then he settled himself on a nearby rock with a sigh of relief, removing his head covering to wipe his brow. "Good water," he said, "pure and cold. The Lord provides these gifts in a dry and thirsty land, does he not?" "He does," Eliam agreed, sitting back down on his own rock. "Are you traveling far?" "Far enough for old bones," the man said with a chuckle. "I come from Jerusalem, heading south to visit my daughter in Hebron. She worries about her old father wandering the roads in these troubled times. But a man must keep moving, or the stillness will claim him." His eyes, sharp as a falcon's despite his age, studied Eliam carefully. "But you look troubled, young one. The shadow in your eyes is not from the sun. Would you share your burden with an old traveler? Sometimes it helps to speak our fears aloud, to give them shape with words so we can see them clearly." Eliam hesitated. He had been taught not to burden strangers with personal matters, yet there was something about this old man that invited confidence, a quality of peaceful attention that made him want to speak. "You mentioned troubled times," he said slowly. "Then you have heard the rumors about the enemy army approaching?" The old man nodded gravely. "I have heard. In Jerusalem the talk is of little else. The king's advisers debate strategy. The warriors sharpen their weapons. The people are afraid." He paused, then added softly, "And you are afraid too." It was not a question, and Eliam found he could not deny it. "Yes," he admitted, the word coming out barely above a whisper. "I am afraid. I keep thinking about what may come. Battle, destruction. My family, my sister, is only 12 years old. What will become of her if the enemy reaches our village? What will become of any of us? I try to have faith, grandfather, but the fear is so heavy. It sits on my chest like a stone, making it hard to breathe." The old man was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant, as if he were looking at something beyond the hills, beyond even the visible sky. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed, taking on a quality that was both gentle and firm, like bedrock beneath soft earth. "Let me tell you something, young Eliam. Fear is not a sin. Even the greatest among our people have known fear. Do you think Moses was not afraid when he stood before Pharaoh? Do you think Joshua felt no trembling in his knees when the walls of Jericho stood before him? Even David, the sweet singer of Israel, the great king, he knew fear intimately. He wrote about it in his songs." "David was brave," Eliam protested. "He killed a giant." "David was human," the old man corrected gently. "He was brave, yes, but his bravery was not the absence of fear. It was something else entirely. It was trust. It was knowing, deep in his bones, that the Lord was with him. There is a psalm David wrote, one of my favorites, that speaks to this very thing. He wrote it when he was being hunted by his enemies, When King Saul sought his life and he had to flee into the wilderness, he had every reason to be terrified, to give in to despair. But listen to what he declared. The old man closed his eyes, and his voice took on the rhythmic cadence of recitation. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? The words seemed to hang in the air, carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. Eliam felt something shift in his chest, as if the stone of fear had moved slightly, creating space for something else. The Lord is my light, he repeated softly. My light and my salvation. Yes, the old man said, opening his eyes. Think about what that means. In darkness, what do we need most? Light. Not to remove the darkness entirely, perhaps, but to show us the path, to help us see where to place our feet. God does not promise to remove every threat from our lives, but he promises to be our light in the midst of them, to show us the way forward when we cannot see. And salvation, that word means deliverance, rescue, safety. When God is your salvation, what enemy can truly harm you? Oh, they may harm your body, yes. We are flesh and blood can be hurt. But the true you, the part that matters, the soul that will outlive these temporary shells we wear, that is held in God's hand, and nothing can snatch it away. Eliam absorbed these words slowly, turning them over in his mind like the smooth stone still resting in his palm. But how do you reach that place, he asked. How do you move from fear to trust? Sounds beautiful when you say it, grandfather, but my heart still pounds when I think of what is coming. I want to trust God, but the fear is so loud. The old man smiled with understanding. Trust is not a feeling, my son. It is a choice, and it is a choice we must make again and again, sometimes moment by moment. David understood this. Later in that same psalm, he wrote about what he desired most in life. Do you know what it was? Not victory in battle, not wealth or power or even long life. He said, "One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple." That was his heart's desire, to be in God's presence, to know God more deeply, because he understood that when you are close to the Lord, when you are dwelling in his presence, everything else falls into proper perspective. A lamb had wandered close to where they sat, and Eliam reached out to stroke its woolly head absently. The animal pressed against his hand, trusting, unafraid. Sheep were simple creatures. They knew their shepherd's voice, and they followed it. When the shepherd was present, they felt safe. When he led them to water, they drank. When he led them to pasture, they grazed. They did not worry about tomorrow or dwell on yesterday. They simply trusted that the shepherd knew what he was doing. Was that the kind of trust God wanted from his people? Not complicated theological understanding, but simple, childlike confidence that their shepherd knew the way and could be trusted to lead them? The psalm speaks of dwelling in God's house, Eliam said thoughtfully. But we cannot all live in the temple in Jerusalem. Most of us will never even visit it more than a few times in our lives. How then do we dwell in the Lord's presence? Ah, the old man said, his eyes lighting up with approval at the question. You are thinking rightly, asking the real questions. The temple is a physical place, yes, a holy place, where God has chosen to make his name dwell. But God's presence is not limited to buildings made by human hands. Did not Solomon himself say, when he dedicated the temple, "Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built?" No, young shepherd, To dwell in God's presence means to live with constant awareness of Him, to invite Him into every moment of your day, to speak with Him as you would speak with a friend who walks beside you. When you lead your sheep to water, God is there. When you lie down to sleep under the stars, God is there. When you face your enemies, God is there. You dwell in His presence not by going to a place, but by awakening to the reality that you are already in that place, that you have always been in that place, that there is nowhere in heaven or earth where His presence does not fill. The sun had reached its zenith now, and the heat pressed down on the valley like a weight. The sheep had stopped their grazing and settled into the shade of the oaks, chewing their cud with half-closed eyes. Even the insects seemed to have quieted their buzzing, yielding to the stillness of midday. Eliam felt drowsy, but his mind was alert, turning over the old man's words, examining them from different angles. His fear had not vanished, not entirely, but it felt different now, less overwhelming. It was still present, like a shadow at the edge of his vision, but it no longer filled his entire field of view. In the psalm, Eliam said, David says, "The Lord is the stronghold of his life." What did he mean by that? A stronghold is a fortress, the old man explained, a place of refuge and defense. In these hills, you know about strongholds, yes? The caves and high places where people can retreat when danger comes, where a few defenders can hold off many attackers because the position is so strong. David knew these places well. He hid in them when Saul hunted him. The cave of Adullam, the strongholds of En-gedi. But he came to understand that the true stronghold was not made of rock and stone. It was the Lord Himself. God was his fortress, his high tower, his place of safety. When David ran to God, he found protection that no physical fortress could provide. Not protection from difficulty necessarily, but protection in the midst of difficulty. The assurance that whatever came, he would not face it alone. Eliam thought of the caves that dotted the hillsides around Bethlehem, the hidden places in the wadis and cliffs. He had explored some of them as a boy, pretending to be a warrior, hiding from enemies, playing at danger when real danger was far away. Now that real danger approached, those caves seemed less like adventure and more like necessity. Would his family need to flee to such places? Would they hide in the darkness, hoping the enemy would pass them by? The thought made his stomach clench with anxiety. If we have to flee, he said, voicing his fear, if the enemy comes and we must hide or run, does that mean our faith is weak? Does it mean we don't trust God enough? Not at all, the old man said firmly. God gave you legs to run and a mind to know when running is wisdom. There is no virtue in foolish bravado, in standing in the path of danger and calling it faith. Even Jesus told his disciples that when they were persecuted in one town, they should flee to another. Wisdom knows when to stand and when to flee, when to fight and when to hide. But here is the key. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. Whether you stand or flee, whether you fight or hide, you do it trusting that God is with you. You do it knowing that He is your stronghold. The circumstances may change, but the foundation does not. David faced many enemies in his life. Sometimes he fought them. Sometimes he fled from them. Sometimes he hid. But in every situation, he brought his fear, his anger, his confusion, his desperation to the Lord. He was honest about his feelings. Read the Psalms sometime and see how brutally honest he was. How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever? My God, why have you forsaken me? These are not the words of someone pretending to be brave. These are the words of someone who knows he can bring his whole heart to God, even the broken, frightened parts. The old man reached for his water skin and took another drink, then continued. David writes in this same psalm, "When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall." Now, that might sound like a promise that his enemies would always be defeated, that he would always win every battle. But that is not what happened in David's life. He lost battles. He lost loved ones. He faced terrible consequences for his own sins. So what did he mean? He meant that in the ultimate sense, in the way that truly matters, those who opposed God's purposes would not prevail. They might win temporary victories, but they could not win the final victory. They could not separate him from God's love. They could not destroy what God was building in him and through him. Their apparent strength was illusion. Their stumbling was certain, even if it came later than he wished. A breeze stirred the oak leaves above them, bringing momentary relief from the heat. Eliam watched the patterns of light and shadow dance across the ground, constantly shifting, never still, like life, he thought, always changing, always in motion, never quite what it was a moment before. The only constant was change, and the only certainty was uncertainty. Unless the old man was right, unless there was something that did not change, something that remained constant beneath all the flux and flow of circumstance, unless God really was the stronghold, the unmovable rock in the midst of raging floods. "Tell me more about the psalm," Eliam said. "What else did David write?" The old man settled himself more comfortably, clearly pleased to continue. David goes on to make a beautiful statement of trust. He says, "Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident." Do you hear what he's saying? He is not saying, "I will not face danger." He is not claiming that enemies will never surround him. He acknowledges the reality of the threat. An army may indeed encamp against him. War may indeed arise, but his response to these real dangers is not determined by the dangers themselves. It is determined by his trust in God. His heart shall not fear. He will be confident, not because the circumstances are safe, but because God is faithful. "That seems impossible," Eliam said quietly. "An army surrounds you, and your heart does not fear? How?" "It is impossible," the old man agreed. "Impossible for human strength alone. But with God, what is impossible?" Consider what David is really saying. He is speaking not of the absence of the emotion of fear, but of the absence of fear's control over him. Fear may knock at the door of his heart, but it does not rule there. God rules there. So when the fear comes, he acknowledges it, but then he turns to something greater. He turns to the one thing he has asked of the Lord, the one thing he seeks after, to dwell in the Lord's house all his days, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to seek his face. "The beauty of the Lord," Eliam repeated softly. "I had never thought of God as beautiful. Powerful, yes, holy, certainly, but beautiful." "Oh, yes," the old man said, and his weathered face seemed to glow with an inner light. "The Lord is beautiful beyond all telling, not in the way a flower is beautiful or a sunset, though these things reflect his beauty. The beauty of God is, how can I explain? It is the beauty of perfect justice married to perfect mercy, the beauty of strength that is never cruel and gentleness that is never weak, the beauty of wisdom that knows the end from the beginning, of love that will not let us go, of faithfulness that endures forever. When you begin to glimpse this beauty, even just a little, everything else fades in comparison. Your fears seem smaller. Your enemies seem less threatening, because you realize you are in the presence of something infinitely greater than anything that opposes you. Eliam tried to imagine what the old man described, but it was like trying to picture a color he had never seen. Still, he felt a stirring in his heart, a longing for something he could not name. Perhaps that longing itself was the beginning of understanding. Perhaps God worked through desire, planting seeds of hunger that only he could satisfy. David also writes something curious in this psalm. The old man continued. He says, "For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock." Now remember, this is the same David who hid in caves and ran from Saul for years. He knew what it was to need physical hiding places. But here he speaks of God hiding him, concealing him, lifting him high. God becomes the cave, the tent, the rock. Sometimes God protects us by changing our circumstances. Sometimes he protects us by giving us strength in the midst of unchanging circumstances. But always, his protection is real. It may not look the way we expect. It may not come when we wish. But it is real. A thought occurred to Eliam. The day of trouble, he said slowly. Not if trouble comes, but when it comes. David expected trouble. He knew it was part of life. Exactly, the old man said with approval. This is wisdom. We live in a fallen world, a world where there is suffering and sorrow, where enemies exist and dangers threaten. To pretend otherwise is foolishness, not faith. Faith is not denial of reality. It is seeing reality clearly, including all its dangers, and then seeing something beyond reality, something more real than reality itself, seeing God's hand at work even in the darkest moments, trusting his purposes even when we cannot understand them. The afternoon was advancing, and Eliam knew he should begin leading his flock back toward the village before evening came. But he was reluctant to leave, reluctant to break the spell of this conversation, to return to the anxious atmosphere of Bethlehem, where every piece of news brought fresh worry. The old man seemed to sense his thoughts. "You must return to your family," he said gently. "They will worry if you're late, but take this with you." He reached into his robe and drew out a small scroll, no bigger than his hand. This is a copy of the psalm we have been discussing, the 27th Psalm of David. I copied it myself many years ago when I was a young scribe, when my own heart was troubled and I needed its words. I have carried it with me ever since. Now I feel it is meant for you. Take it, read it when fear comes. Let its words sink deep into your soul. Eliam accepted the scroll with trembling hands, awed by the gift. Scrolls were precious things, not given lightly. "Grandfather, I cannot. This is too much." "It is not too much," the old man said firmly. "It is what is needed. The words have served me well for many years. Now they will serve you. But remember, young Eliam, words on parchment are just words. They become alive only when you believe them, when you let them shape how you see the world, when you act as if they are true. David did not just write about trusting God. He lived it. He made choices based on it. And that is what you must do as well. They rose together, and Eliam helped the old man gather his things. As the traveler prepared to continue his journey south, Eliam felt compelled to ask one more question. "Grandfather, the psalm speaks of seeking God's face. What does that mean?" The old man paused, one hand on his staff, his eyes distant. To seek someone's face is to seek their presence, their attention, their favor. In the culture of our people, we speak of a king's face shining upon his subjects, of someone finding favor in another's eyes. To seek God's face is to desire his presence above all else, to want to know him, to be known by him. David writes, "Your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me." This is the heart's deepest cry, not for God's gifts, but for God himself. When we truly seek His face, when we desire Him more than we desire safety or comfort or success, something shifts in our souls. We find that He was already seeking us, that He has never hidden His face except to draw us into deeper seeking. One more thing, the old man added, his voice soft but urgent. At the end of the psalm, David gives a command. He says, "Wait for the Lord, be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord." Notice the repetition. Wait for the Lord. He says it twice, as if we need to hear it more than once, as if our tendency is to rush ahead in our fear, to take matters into our own hands, to try to solve everything by our own strength. But David says, wait, be strong, take courage, and wait again. This is one of the hardest things faith requires of us, to wait, to trust that God's timing is better than ours, that His delays are not denials, that He is working even when we cannot see it. In the coming days, Eliam, you may need to wait when everything in you wants to act. You may need to be still when everything in you wants to run. This is not passivity. This is active trust. This is the hardest kind of courage. With those words, the old man blessed Eliam with the traditional blessing of the priests, his hand raised, his voice strong. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. Then he turned and continued on his way, his staff clicking against the stones, his white robe gradually disappearing around a bend in the path until he was gone, leaving Eliam alone with his thoughts and his sheep and the small precious scroll in his hand. Eliam stood for a long moment, watching the place where the old man had vanished, feeling as if something significant had just occurred, though he could not quite name what it was. The afternoon sun was gentler now, the harsh heat of midday giving way to the softer warmth of late afternoon. He called to his sheep, and they responded to his voice, rising from their resting places and gathering around him, ready to follow wherever he led. As he guided them back toward Bethlehem, he thought about everything the old man had said, turning the words over and over in his mind like prayer beads. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The words had a rhythm to them, a cadence that matched his footsteps on the path. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? He realized he was speaking the words aloud, softly at first, then with growing confidence. The sheep continued their steady progress, unconcerned, trusting their shepherd to lead them safely home. Could he trust his shepherd the same way? Could he follow that easily, that completely? The village came into view as the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the limestone houses in shades of gold and amber. From this distance, it looked peaceful, eternal, as if it had always stood there and would always stand there, unchanging. But Eliam knew better now. Everything changed. Everything was temporary and fragile. Everything except what? Except God. Except the love that had created the universe and held it together. Except the purposes that had been set in motion before the foundation of the world and would continue long after these stones had crumbled to dust. If that was true, if God was truly eternal, if His love truly endured forever, then perhaps the coming danger was not the end of everything. Perhaps it was simply another chapter in a story that had been unfolding since the beginning of time. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of crimson and gold, Eliam sat with his family for the evening meal. His mother had prepared a simple dinner of lentil stew, flatbread still warm from the baking stone, and olives from their own small grove. His father led them in the traditional blessing, his voice steady and sure despite the worry that had lined his face in recent days. Hannah, his sister, sat quietly, her young eyes watching her brother with a curious expression, as if she sensed something had changed in him. "You seem different tonight," his father observed as they ate, his keen scribe's eyes missing nothing. "More at peace, perhaps. Did something happen on the hills today?" Eliam hesitated, then reached into his cloak and withdrew the small scroll the old man had given him. "I met a traveler today, Father, an old man traveling from Jerusalem to Hebron. We spoke for a long time, and he gave me this." He carefully unrolled the scroll, revealing the beautiful script, each letter formed with precision and care. "It is the 27th Psalm of David." Tobias leaned forward, his professional interest immediately engaged. He studied the script with an expert eye, noting the quality of the ink, the evenness of the letters, the careful spacing. "This is fine work," he murmured, "the hand of a skilled scribe. This is no ordinary gift, my son." "Scrolls are precious. What did you talk about that moved him to give you something so valuable?" "Fear," Eliam said simply. "I told him I was afraid of the coming army, of what might happen to all of us, and he shared this psalm with me. We spoke of what it means to trust God when everything around you is falling apart." His mother set down her cup, her eyes soft with understanding. "And did you find answers?" "I found something," Eliam said slowly, trying to put into words what he barely understood himself. "Not answers exactly, but a different way of seeing things. The old man said that fear is not a sin, that even David knew fear. But David chose to trust anyway. He chose to see God as his light, his stronghold, his salvation, even when armies surrounded him." Tobias nodded thoughtfully. "Read it to us," he said. "Let us hear David's words." So Eliam read, his voice growing stronger as he spoke the ancient words. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" The words seemed to fill their small home, pushing back the shadows, bringing a warmth that had nothing to do with the cooking fire. His family listened in silence, and Eliam saw his mother's eyes glisten with tears, his father's lips moving silently as if committing the words to memory, his sister leaning forward, captivated. When he finished reading, silence hung in the air for a long moment. Then Hannah spoke, her young voice clear and thoughtful. "It's like the psalm my teacher taught us last week," she said. "The one where David says God is a shepherd. This one is different, but also the same. It's about God taking care of us." "Yes," Tobias said, pride in his voice. "You understand well, daughter. The Psalms are different prayers, different songs, but they all come from the same heart of trust. David knew God in many ways, as shepherd, as king, as warrior, as father, as light in darkness. And in every way, God proved faithful." "But Father," Eliam said, voicing the question that still troubled him, "what if the enemy does come? What if we lose everything? Does this psalm promise that God will always protect us from harm?" His father was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. As a scribe, he had spent years studying the sacred texts, pondering their meanings, discussing them with other learned men. "The Psalms promise us God's presence," he said finally. "They promise us His faithfulness, His love that endures forever. But they do not promise us a life without suffering. Look at David himself. He wrote these words while running for his life. He knew exile, betrayal, loss, grief. His own son tried to kill him, and yet, through it all, he clung to God. Not because God made his life easy, but because God made his life meaningful. There is a difference, my son, a great difference." The night deepened around them, and one by one the lamps were lit. their warm glow creating pools of light in the darkness. Through the small window, Eliam could see stars beginning to appear, those same stars that had watched over Abraham when God made his covenant, that had guided the Israelites through the wilderness, that had witnessed every prayer ever lifted to heaven. They were constant, unchanging, reliable, like God himself. Before they retired for the night, Tobias led the family in evening prayers as he did every night. But tonight, he included the words from the psalm Eliam had shared. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple. The words hung in the air like incense, sweet and lingering. That night, lying on his mat in the darkness, Eliam found sleep came more easily than it had in many nights. The fear was still there, still real, but it no longer dominated his thoughts. Instead, he found himself repeating the words of the psalm like a prayer, like a rope to hold on to in a storm. The Lord is my light and my salvation. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. The words became a rhythm, matching his breathing, settling deep into his bones. Part 2. The Journey. Wave 1. The Desert of Testing. The next day dawned clear and bright, the kind of morning that made it hard to believe anything could threaten their peaceful existence. But as Eliam led his flock out to pasture, he noticed something that made his heart quicken. On the main road below the village, a steady stream of people moved northward. Not the usual traffic of merchants and travelers, but families, whole households, their donkeys loaded with possessions, children clinging to their mothers' robes, elderly grandparents struggling to keep pace. They were refugees, people fleeing before the advancing army. Eliam left his flock in the care of another shepherd and hurried down to the road. He recognized some of the travelers, people from villages to the south, places he had visited on market days. Their faces were etched with exhaustion and fear, dust covering their clothes and hair, their eyes constantly scanning the horizon as if expecting pursuit. "Simon," he called out, recognizing a merchant he knew. "What has happened? What news from the south?" The merchant stopped, his weathered face grim. "The army has taken Hebron," he said, his voice hoarse. "They swept through like locusts, taking everything. We barely escaped. They say they will march on Bethlehem next, and then Jerusalem. No one can stand against them. Their warriors are like giants, their weapons like instruments of the gods. We are fleeing north, hoping to find refuge beyond Jerusalem. You should do the same, boy. Tell your village to flee while there is still time." The words struck Eliam like physical blows. Hebron had fallen, the ancient city where Abraham had purchased a burial cave for Sarah, where the patriarchs themselves were entombed. If Hebron could fall, what hope did a small village like Bethlehem have? He returned to the hills in a daze, his earlier peace shattered by the news. Throughout the day, more refugees passed on the road below, a constant stream of displaced humanity. By evening, the elders of Bethlehem had called a meeting in the synagogue square. The entire village gathered, faces tight with worry, voices raised in argument and fear. "We must flee," one elder insisted. "We have seen what happens to those who resist. Better to lose our homes than our lives. And where will we go?" Another countered. "North is no safer. The enemy will reach Jerusalem. Perhaps we should surrender, offer tribute, hope for mercy." "There is no mercy in these invaders," a third voice called out. "I have heard the stories from those who survived. Better to fight and die than to bow to foreign gods." The argument grew heated, voices rising, hands gesturing, fear transmuting into anger, as it so often does when people feel powerless. Eliam stood at the edge of the crowd, listening, feeling the panic rising around him like floodwater. His hand unconsciously went to the scroll tucked in his belt, touching it like a talisman. Then his father stood. Tobias was not a loud man, not given to dramatic gestures or stirring speeches, but when he spoke, people listened. There was an authority in his quiet voice, the authority of one who had spent his life in the service of sacred words. "My brothers," he said, his voice cutting through the din, "we are afraid. That is natural. That is human. But let us not make decisions in panic that we will regret in calmer times. Before we decide whether to flee or fight or surrender, let us pray. Let us seek the face of the Lord. Let us remember who we are and whose we are." "Prayer will not stop an army," someone shouted from the back. "No," Tobias agreed calmly. "Prayer will not stop an army. But prayer will remind us that there are things more important than armies. Prayer will connect us to something eternal, something that exists beyond the reach of any earthly power. And prayer will give us clarity to make wise decisions rather than fearful ones." There was grumbling, but also assent. The village was devout, and even in crisis, the habit of faith ran deep. The rabbi stepped forward and began to lead them in prayer, his ancient voice rising and falling in the familiar cadences of supplication. And as he prayed, Eliam felt something shift in the atmosphere. Not that the danger disappeared, not that the fear vanished, but something else entered the space, something that was harder to define but no less real. A presence, a sense of not being alone. When the prayer ended, the rabbi spoke. "We will not decide tonight," he said. "We will watch and wait. We will send scouts to learn more about the enemy's movements. We will prepare, yes, but we will not panic. And we will trust that the God who led our ancestors through the wilderness, who toppled the walls of Jericho, who gave David victory over Goliath, that this God still sees us, still knows us, still holds us in his hands." The meeting dissolved into smaller conversations, groups of neighbors discussing what to do, how to prepare. Some began making plans to pack essential belongings. Others started organizing a watch rotation. Still others went home to pray with their families. The village was doing what humans have always done in times of crisis, trying to hold on to hope while preparing for the worst. That night, Eliam could not sleep. He lay on his mat, listening to the sounds of the village, hearing doors opening and closing, voices murmuring, animals being moved, the ordinary sounds of life overlaid with an edge of urgency and fear. Finally, he rose and climbed to the roof of his house, where the night air was cooler and the stars were visible in all their glory. He pulled out the scroll and unrolled it carefully, though the darkness made it impossible to read. But he didn't need to see the words. He had read them so many times since receiving the scroll that they were written on his heart. He spoke them aloud, softly, as if the words themselves were a prayer. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" His voice was barely a whisper, but it seemed loud in the stillness of the night. "The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" As he spoke, he thought about what those words really meant. Not a magic formula to make problems disappear, not a guarantee of physical safety, but a declaration of trust, a choice to see reality through the lens of God's faithfulness rather than through the lens of circumstance. The old traveler had been right. Trust was not a feeling, it was a choice. And it was a choice that had to be made again and again, moment by moment, especially when everything screamed at you to give in to fear. When evildoers assail me to eat up my flesh, my adversaries and foes, it is they who stumble and fall. The words took on new meaning now. There were evildoers approaching. There were adversaries. But David had faced such enemies before many times, and he had learned something that transcended any individual battle or conflict. He had learned that in the ultimate sense, in the way that truly mattered, those who opposed God's purposes would not prevail. Eliam thought about the refugees he had seen on the road, their haunted eyes, their weary steps. They had lost their homes, their security, their sense of safety. But had they lost everything? They were still alive. They were still together as families. They still carried within them their faith, their identity, their stories. The enemy could take their possessions, could destroy their houses, could even take their lives. But there were some things that remained beyond the reach of any earthly power. The thought brought him a strange comfort, not because he wanted to die or to see his family suffer, but because it helped him understand what was truly at stake and what was not. His life was important, but it was not ultimate. His safety mattered, but it was not the foundation of his existence. God was the foundation. God was the constant. Everything else was temporary, shifting, subject to change. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. Could he say those words and mean them? Could he truly claim that confidence? He wanted to, but he also knew he was still afraid. The fear was there, coiled in his chest like a living thing. Perhaps, he thought, the confidence David spoke of was not the absence of fear, but the presence of something greater than fear. Perhaps it was possible to be afraid and confident at the same time, to acknowledge the danger while trusting in something beyond the danger. The night wore on, and gradually the village settled into uneasy sleep. Eliam remained on the roof, wrapped in his cloak against the night chill, watching the stars wheel slowly across the sky. He thought about Abraham, who had looked at these same stars when God promised to make his descendants as numerous as the lights of heaven. He thought about Jacob, who had seen angels ascending and descending on a ladder connecting earth and heaven. He thought about Moses, who had encountered God in a burning bush in the wilderness. He thought about David, who had tended flocks in these very hills before becoming king. They had all faced impossible situations. They had all known fear and uncertainty. But they had all discovered that God was faithful, that his promises were sure, that his presence was real. Not that their lives were easy, not that they never suffered, but that suffering was not the end of the story, that God was always at work, even in the darkest moments, weaving together a tapestry whose full pattern would not be visible until the end of time. As dawn approached, painting the eastern sky with streaks of rose and gold, Eliam felt a resolution forming in his heart. He did not know what the coming days would bring. He did not know if the enemy would reach Bethlehem, if they would have to flee or fight or surrender. He did not know if he would live to see old age or if his life would be cut short by violence. But he knew one thing with a certainty that transcended understanding. He knew that God was with him. He knew that whatever came, he would not face it alone. And he knew that this knowledge, this trust, was worth more than any earthly security. He descended from the roof as the village began to wake. His mother was already grinding grain for the morning bread, the familiar sound of stone on stone, a comforting reminder of normalcy. His father was preparing for morning prayers, wrapping his prayer shawl around his shoulders with practiced motions. Hannah was still sleeping, her face peaceful in slumber, innocent of the troubles that weighed on the adults. "You were on the roof all night," his mother observed, not as a question, but as a statement. "Did you find what you were seeking?" "I'm not sure," Eliam admitted, "but I found something. A kind of peace, maybe. Not the peace of having no problems, but the peace of knowing that the problems are not the whole story." His mother smiled, a sad but understanding smile. "That is wisdom beyond your years," she said. "Hold on to it. We will need it in the days ahead." The days that followed were strange, suspended between normalcy and crisis. Life continued. Sheep still needed to be tended. Fields still needed to be worked. Bread still needed to be baked. But underneath the routine, there was a constant tension, a sense of waiting for a storm that had not yet broken, but whose approach could be felt in every gust of wind. More refugees passed through, each with new stories of the enemy's advance. The army was massive, they said. Thousands of warriors, cavalry on horses, siege equipment that could reduce walls to rubble. They worshipped strange gods, performed brutal rituals, showed no mercy to those who resisted. The stories grew in the telling, fear adding embellishments, rumor mixing with fact, until it was hard to know what was true and what was exaggeration. Eliam continued his daily routine, leading his flock to pasture, but his mind was restless. The psalm had given him a kind of anchor, a place to return to when the fear threatened to overwhelm him. But he still felt incomplete, as if there was something more he needed to understand, some deeper truth he had not yet grasped. On the third day after the refugees had begun passing through, Eliam made a decision. He went to his father and said, "I want to go to Jerusalem, to the temple, to pray there, to seek God's face in the holy place. I feel like I need to make a pilgrimage to complete what began when the old man gave me the psalm." Tobias studied his son's face for a long moment. "It is a dangerous time to travel," he said slowly. "The roads are full of desperate people. There are bandits who prey on refugees. And if the enemy reaches Jerusalem before you return—" "I know," Eliam said, "but I also know I need to do this. I can't explain it, Father. It's like a pull, a calling. The psalm speaks of dwelling in the house of the Lord, of gazing upon his beauty in the temple. I need to experience that. I need to know what it means, not just in words, but in reality." His father was quiet for a long time, his scribe's mind weighing considerations, his father's heart torn between protection and understanding. Finally, he nodded. "Go," he said, "but go with my blessing and my prayers. Take food and water. Stay on the main roads. If you encounter danger, hide. Do not try to be a hero. And come back to us, my son. Come back with whatever you find." His mother wept when she heard of his decision, but she did not try to stop him. Instead, she packed food for his journey, her hands moving with practiced efficiency, even as tears ran down her cheeks. "Remember who you are," she said as she pressed the bundle into his hands. "Remember whose you are, and remember that we will be waiting for you." Hannah clung to him, her young face frightened. "Promise you'll come back," she demanded. "Promise, Eliam." He held her close, feeling the weight of the promise she asked for. He could not promise. No one could promise such things in a world where death was always near, where accidents and illness and violence could cut a life short without warning. But he could promise something else. "I promise I will do everything I can to come back to you," he said. "And I promise that whether I come back or not, God will take care of you. He will be your light and your stronghold, just as he is mine." He set out in the early morning, before the sun had fully risen, his staff in his hand, his water skin on his belt, his small pack of provisions on his back. and the precious scroll tucked safely in his inner pocket. The road to Jerusalem was well traveled, worn smooth by countless pilgrims who had made this journey over centuries. It was the road David had traveled when he brought the Ark of the Covenant to the holy city. It was the road Solomon had traveled when he went to dedicate the great temple. It was the road every faithful Jew hoped to travel at least once in their lifetime for the great festivals. But today, the road had a different character. It was crowded with refugees, families fleeing south as Eliam traveled north, creating a strange countercurrent. He moved against the flow, and more than one person called out to him, warning him, asking why he was going toward danger rather than away from it. He had no good answer except to say, "I must go to Jerusalem. I must pray at the temple." Some looked at him as if he were mad. Others nodded with understanding, seeing in his eyes the determination of faith that transcended logic. One old woman caught his arm as he passed and said, "May the Lord bless your journey, young pilgrim. We need people who still remember to seek His face, especially in dark times." The road climbed through the hill country, rising and falling with the contours of the land. The landscape was harsh, but beautiful. Limestone rocks jutting from the earth like bones, terraced fields clinging to the hillsides where farmers had coaxed life from the stony soil, olive groves, silver green in the morning light. Wild herbs grew between the stones, filling the air with the scent of thyme and hyssop. Lizards darted across the path, and high above, a hawk circled on the thermal currents. As he walked, Eliam found himself falling into a rhythm, his footsteps marking time, his breathing steady and deep. He began to pray, not formal prayers, but conversation, speaking to God as the old man had encouraged him to do, as if to a friend walking beside him. He spoke of his fears, his doubts, his hopes. He spoke of his family, asking for their protection. He spoke of his village, pleading for mercy. He spoke of himself, admitting his weakness, his inadequacy, his desperate need for strength beyond his own. And as he prayed, something began to shift within him. The fear did not disappear, but it began to take on a different quality. It became less like a weight dragging him down, and more like a companion he could acknowledge without being controlled by it. Yes, he was afraid. Yes, the situation was dire. But he was not alone. Even here, on this dusty road, surrounded by displaced people and approaching danger, God was present. The awareness of that presence did not solve his problems, but it changed everything nonetheless. By midday, the sun was fierce, and Eliam stopped to rest in the shade of an ancient terebinth tree. Other travelers rested there too, a small community of strangers brought together by necessity. An old man was sharing bread with a young family whose children looked hungry. A woman was tending to her elderly mother, helping her drink from a water skin. Two young men were discussing whether to join the king's army to fight against the invaders, their voices full of bravado that barely masked their fear. Eliam sat quietly, eating the bread his mother had packed, listening to the conversations around him. Each person had a story. Each person was facing their own crisis. And yet here they were, sharing shade, sharing food, sharing the small kindnesses that make human survival possible. It was a reminder that even in the worst of times, goodness persisted. Even in the face of evil, people chose compassion. Even when everything was falling apart, something essential remained intact. "You're traveling north," a voice said beside him. Eliam turned to see a middle-aged man, his face weathered by sun and work, his clothes dusty from the road. "That's unusual these days. Most sensible people are heading south." "I'm going to Jerusalem," Eliam replied. To the temple. The man studied him for a moment, then nodded. A pilgrim, he said. I was a pilgrim once. Went to Jerusalem for Passover when I was about your age. Changed my life being in that place, standing in the courts where David stood, seeing the temple Solomon built, feeling, I don't know how to describe it, feeling small and large at the same time. Small because you realize how vast God is, large because you realize this vast God cares about you. That's what I'm hoping to find, Eliam said. Some kind of understanding, some kind of peace. Peace, the man repeated, his voice sad. That's what we all want, isn't it? But peace is hard to find when the world is on fire. He paused, then added, but maybe that's when we need it most. Maybe that's when it means the most. Any fool can have peace when everything's going well. It takes faith to have peace when everything is falling apart. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the refugees pass on the road, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves of the tree above them. Then the man rose, preparing to continue his journey south. Good luck, young pilgrim, he said. I hope you find what you're looking for. And I hope there's still a temple to pray at when you arrive. I hope there's still a Jerusalem to be saved. The words haunted Eliam as he resumed his own journey. What if the enemy reached Jerusalem before him? What if the city fell while he was on the road? What if he arrived to find only ruins and destruction? The thought made his heart race with anxiety, but he forced himself to return to the words of the psalm. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Not the temple, not Jerusalem, not any physical place or structure. God himself was the foundation. God himself was the constant. Everything else might fall, but God would remain. The afternoon wore on and the road grew steeper as it approached the hills surrounding Jerusalem. Eliam's legs ached, his feet were sore, and he was more tired than he had ever been from a day of shepherding. But he pressed on, driven by a compulsion he could not fully explain. He needed to reach Jerusalem. He needed to complete this pilgrimage. It felt like something essential depended on it, though he could not have said what. As evening approached, he came to a small village perched on a hillside. It was not much, just a cluster of houses around a central well, but it offered shelter and the possibility of rest. He approached cautiously, aware that strange times made people wary of strangers. But when the villagers saw he was a young man alone, carrying only a shepherd's staff and a small pack, they relaxed. An elderly woman offered him a place to sleep in her courtyard, along with a simple meal of bread and olives. It's not safe to travel at night, she said, her voice carrying the authority of age. Stay here, rest, continue your journey in the morning. Eliam accepted gratefully, his body crying out for rest. As darkness fell, he sat with several of the villagers around a small fire in the central square. They wanted news from the south, and he shared what he knew, carefully and honestly, without exaggerating, but without minimizing either. In return, they shared what they had heard from travelers coming from the north. Jerusalem is preparing for siege, one man said, his voice grim. The king has called up all able-bodied men. They're strengthening the walls, stockpiling food and water. They say if the city can hold out long enough, help might come from Egypt or from the tribes to the east. But if it falls... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The priests are offering special prayers, a woman added. Day and night they cry out to the Lord for deliverance. The whole city is fasting and praying. If ever there was a time for faith, it is now. As they talked, Eliam noticed a young boy sitting at the edge of the group, listening intently. The child couldn't have been more than 7 or 8, his eyes wide in his thin face. When there was a lull in the conversation, the boy spoke up, his voice clear and innocent. My teacher says God always protects his people, the boy said. He says we don't need to be afraid because God is stronger than any army. Is that true? The adults fell silent, and Eliam could see them struggling with how to answer. How do you explain to a child that faith doesn't work like a shield that deflects every arrow? How do you communicate that God's protection sometimes looks very different from what we expect? Finally, the elderly woman who had offered Eliam shelter spoke. Your teacher is right, he said gently. God is stronger than any army. But sometimes God's strength works in ways we don't expect. Sometimes he protects us by giving us courage to face hard things. Sometimes he protects us by helping us survive when everything seems lost. And sometimes, her voice caught, sometimes he protects us by welcoming us home to heaven when our time on earth is done. But yes, child, God always takes care of his people. Always. That is a promise we can hold on to no matter what happens. The boy seemed satisfied with this answer, nodding solemnly. But Eliam saw tears in the woman's eyes, and he wondered what losses she had endured in her long life, what promises of protection she had had to reconcile with painful reality. Faith, he was beginning to understand, was not simple. It was not a formula or a guarantee. It was something deeper and more costly than he had imagined. That night, lying on a woven mat in the courtyard, staring up at the stars visible through the lattice of vines overhead, Eliam thought about the boy's question and the woman's answer. He thought about all the people throughout history who had trusted God and suffered anyway, prophets who were rejected and killed, faithful men and women who lost everything, even Jesus himself, who would come later, though Eliam did not know this, would cry out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" on a Roman cross. What did it mean to trust God in a world where terrible things happened? What did it mean to call God a stronghold when strongholds could be breached, when even the mightiest fortresses could fall? The easy answers he had grown up with, the simple formulas of righteousness leading to blessing and sin leading to curse, seemed inadequate now. Life was more complex than that. Faith was more complex than that. And yet, even as he wrestled with these thoughts, he felt again that strange peace he had known on the rooftop back home. It was not the peace of having all his questions answered. It was not the peace of knowing everything would turn out well. It was something else, something harder to define. It was the peace of knowing he was held, even in the questions. The peace of knowing that his confusion and doubt and fear were not obstacles to faith, but part of the journey of faith. The peace of knowing that God was big enough to handle his honesty, strong enough to hold him even when he was weak. He drifted off to sleep with the psalm on his lips, the words now feeling less like a confident declaration and more like a desperate prayer, a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. The Lord is my light and my salvation. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Say it enough times, he thought, and maybe it becomes true. Or maybe it was always true, and saying it enough times just helps you see what was already there. Morning came too soon, accompanied by the sounds of the village waking, roosters crowing, goats bleating, the rhythms of daily life reasserting themselves despite all the uncertainty. Eliam rose, thanked his hostess, and prepared to continue his journey. The woman pressed extra bread into his hands, refusing to take payment. "You're traveling to pray," she said simply. "Pray for us while you're at the temple. Pray for this village, for our children, for all of us who are too old or too young or too afraid to run. Pray that when the storm passes, some of us are still standing." He promised he would, moved by her simple faith, her assumption that prayer mattered, that somehow his prayers at the temple might make a difference. It was a heavy responsibility, carrying the hopes of strangers, but also a gift. It reminded him that he was not alone in his fear, not alone in his need for God. All across this land, people were crying out, seeking, hoping, trusting against all evidence that God was still listening, still caring, still present. The road to Jerusalem grew more crowded as he drew nearer to the city. Not just refugees now, but also pilgrims like himself, people drawn by faith or desperation or both to the holy city. There were merchants too, those brave or foolish enough to still conduct business in such uncertain times. And there were soldiers, the king's men heading south to reinforce garrisons, their faces grim with the knowledge of what they might face. By late morning, Eliam crested a final rise and saw it. Jerusalem, the city of David, the city of God. It rose from the surrounding hills like a crown, its walls massive and imposing, its towers reaching toward heaven. And at its heart, gleaming in the sunlight, was the temple. Even from a distance, it was magnificent, its white limestone walls radiant, its golden decorations catching the light and throwing it back to the sky. Eliam stood transfixed, his breath catching in his throat. All his life he had heard stories of Jerusalem, had imagined what it must be like, but the reality exceeded anything he had pictured. It was not just a city. It was a statement, a declaration carved in stone. It proclaimed that the God of Israel was real, was powerful, was worthy of the most beautiful dwelling humans could create. But as he drew closer, he also saw signs of the current crisis. The walls were lined with soldiers. Supplies were being brought in through the gates and stored in warehouses. Families were arriving from the countryside, seeking refuge behind the city's formidable defenses. There was an atmosphere of purposeful urgency, people going about their business but with an undercurrent of tension, of waiting for the other shoe to drop. Eliam joined the stream of people entering through one of the city gates. Guards were checking everyone who entered, asking their business, making sure no spies or troublemakers slipped in with the refugees. When Eliam's turn came, he simply said, "I'm a pilgrim. I've come to pray at the temple." The guard, a young man not much older than Eliam himself, looked at him with a mixture of respect and pity. "You picked a hell of a time to make a pilgrimage," he said, then caught himself. You picked a difficult time, but go ahead. The temple is open. The priests are praying day and night. Maybe God will hear. Maybe he'll remember his city, his people. Maybe." He didn't finish, just waved Eliam through, already turning his attention to the next person in line. Eliam entered Jerusalem, and it felt like entering another world. The streets were narrow and crowded, twisting and turning, rising and falling with the contours of the hills on which the city was built. The smells were overwhelming after the clean air of the countryside, cooking food, animal waste, human sweat, incense from countless small shrines, the metallic tang of blood from the butcher's quarter. People were everywhere, a river of humanity flowing through narrow streets built for a fraction of this number. Merchants called out their wares, their voices competing with the bleating of sheep being driven to the temple for sacrifice. Children darted between adults' legs, laughing despite the tension in the air. Women balanced water jars on their heads with practiced grace, moving through the crowd like dancers. And everywhere, the smell of humanity pressed together. Sweat and perfume, spices and animals, bread baking and refuse rotting. Eliam made his way slowly through the streets, asking directions, following the flow of pilgrims heading toward the Temple Mount. With each step closer, his heart beat faster. not from exertion, but from anticipation. He was about to enter the house of God, the dwelling place of the name, the point where heaven and earth met. The temple rose before him, and even having seen it from a distance, its proximity stole his breath. The outer walls were massive, built from stone so large it seemed impossible that human hands could have placed them. The gates were open, and people streamed in and out, a constant flow of worshipers, priests, merchants, and seekers. Eliam passed through the court of the Gentiles, where money changers did their business and vendors sold doves and lambs for sacrifice. The noise here was tremendous, a cacophony of commerce and religion intermingled. But as he passed into the inner courts, the atmosphere changed. Here, the architecture itself seemed to demand reverence. Columns rose like prayers turned to stone. Arches framed views of the holy place where only priests could enter. And the light seemed different here, as if the sun itself knew this was sacred ground and shone with particular brilliance on the white marble and gold. Eliam found a quiet corner in one of the porticos, a covered walkway where he could sit and simply be. His body was exhausted from the journey, but his spirit was alert, awake in a way it had not been before. He watched the priests moving through their rituals with precision born of lifetimes of practice. He saw families bringing their offerings, children wide-eyed with wonder, old men bent with age lifting their hands in prayer. He heard the Levites singing, their voices trained and beautiful, lifting psalms that David himself might have sung in this very place. And slowly, gradually, he pulled out the scroll the old man had given him. His hands trembled slightly as he unrolled it once more. But this time, reading the words in this place, everything was different. The words were not just words. They were doorways. They were windows. They were keys that unlocked something deep within his soul. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? As he read, he remembered the darkness of the valley he had walked through on his journey here. He remembered the fear that had gripped him in Bethlehem when the refugees passed. He remembered every moment of terror and anxiety that had plagued him, and he understood now, truly understood, that light was not the absence of darkness. Light was the presence of God in the darkness. The darkness might remain, but it could not overcome the light. The salvation God offered was not escape from difficulty, but presence in the midst of it. The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? He looked up at the massive stones of the temple, this fortress of faith. But he knew now that the real stronghold was not made of stone. It was made of promise. It was made of presence. God himself was the fortress, and that fortress could never be breached, never be destroyed, never fall, because it was not subject to the limitations of physical things. An army could destroy this temple, but they could not touch the God who dwelt beyond it. Though an army encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. Though war arise against me, yet I will be confident. The words no longer seemed impossible. He understood now that this was not a declaration of feeling, but a declaration of choice. David had chosen to trust, not because the circumstances were safe, but because God was faithful. And Eliam could make that same choice, was making that choice even now, even here, with war approaching and danger real and the future uncertain. The sun moved across the sky, marking the passage of hours, but Eliam barely noticed. He was lost in contemplation, in prayer, in a kind of communion that transcended words. At times he wept, tears rolling down his face without shame. At times he smiled, joy bubbling up from some deep spring within him. At times, he simply sat in silence, feeling the presence of something greater than himself surrounding him, holding him, loving him. Other pilgrims came and went. Some glanced at him curiously, this young shepherd sitting alone with a scroll and tears on his face. But most were too absorbed in their own encounters with the divine to pay him much attention. This was Jerusalem. This was the temple. Such things were common here. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Eliam became aware of a group gathering nearby. They were singing, their voices rising in harmony, and he recognized the psalm they sang. It was the same one he held in his hands, the 27th Psalm of David. He listened, letting the words wash over him, and this time he heard things he had never heard before. One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple the beauty of the Lord. He closed his eyes and tried to perceive it, not with physical eyes, but with the eyes of the heart. And slowly, like dawn breaking, he began to see the beauty of perfect love, the beauty of infinite wisdom, the beauty of justice married to mercy, the beauty of power that stooped to care for the smallest sparrow, the beauty of eternity that entered time for the sake of those bound by it. It was not a vision exactly. It was more like a knowing, a certainty that settled into his bones. God was beautiful beyond all telling, and to seek his face, to desire his presence above all else, this was the purpose of life. Not success, not safety, not even survival, but this, to know God and be known by him. The singing continued, and Eliam found himself joining in, his voice rough from disuse, but sincere. For he will hide me in his shelter in the day of trouble. He will conceal me under the cover of his tent. He will lift me high upon a rock. He thought of the cave where he and his family might need to hide if the enemy came. But he understood now that the physical hiding place was merely a symbol of the spiritual reality. God was his true shelter. God was his covering. And even if the cave was found, even if the hiding place was breached, even if the worst happened, he was still hidden in God, concealed in the shadow of the Almighty, lifted high above the reach of any earthly power. Now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me, and I will offer in his tent sacrifices with shouts of joy. I will sing and make melody to the Lord. Joy. Despite everything, despite the approaching army and the uncertainty and the very real possibility of suffering and loss, there was joy. Not happiness dependent on circumstances, but joy that flowed from a deeper source, joy that came from knowing he was loved, he was held, he was never alone, joy that came from understanding that his life had meaning beyond its length, purpose beyond its comfort, significance beyond its success. As evening approached, the priests began the evening sacrifice. Eliam watched as they went through the ancient rituals, the smoke of the offerings rising toward heaven, carrying with it the prayers of the people. He added his own prayer, not for safety or deliverance from danger, but for one thing only, that he might continue to dwell in God's presence, to seek his face, to know him more deeply with each passing day, whatever those days might bring. When the sacrifice was complete and the evening prayers concluded, Eliam made his way out of the temple complex. The city was preparing for night, lamps being lit in windows, families gathering for evening meals, the business of the day giving way to the quiet of the night. He found a small inn where pilgrims could stay, paying for a simple mat in a crowded room. But he did not go inside immediately. Instead, he climbed to the roof, as was his custom, to watch the stars emerge. Jerusalem spread out below him, a tapestry of light and shadow. In the distance, he could see the temple, still illuminated by torches and lamps, a beacon in the darkness. And beyond the city walls, the hills of Judea rolled away into the night, the same hills where David had tended sheep, where prophets had received visions, where the story of God's people had unfolded across centuries. He pulled out the scroll once more and read the final verses by the light of a small lamp he had borrowed. "Hear, O Lord, when I cry aloud. Be gracious to me and answer me. You have said, 'Seek my face.' My heart says to you, 'Your face, Lord, do I seek. Hide not your face from me.'" This was the heart cry of every soul who had ever lived, Eliam realized. This yearning for connection with the divine, this desire to be seen and known by the one who made us. We were created for this relationship, fashioned for this communion. And God, in his infinite mercy, had never hidden his face except to draw us into deeper seeking. Wait for the Lord. Be strong, and let your heart take courage. Wait for the Lord. The psalm ended where it began, with an exhortation to trust. But now the exhortation came with the authority of experience. David was not speaking from theory, but from lived reality. He had waited for the Lord through long years of exile. He had been strong when everything within him wanted to despair. He had taken courage when fear seemed more reasonable. And God had proven faithful. Again and again and again, God had proven faithful. Eliam looked up at the stars, those ancient lights that had witnessed so much history, and he made his own declaration, speaking it aloud into the night air. "I will wait for the Lord. I will be strong. I will let my heart take courage. Whatever comes, I will wait for the Lord." The words were not magic. They did not change his circumstances. The enemy was still approaching. The danger was still real. His family was still in potential peril. But something had changed within him. The fear was still present, but it no longer ruled him. The uncertainty was still there, but it no longer paralyzed him. He had found something stronger than fear, something more certain than circumstances. He had found God, and in finding God, he had found himself. Part 3. The Transformation continued. Chapter 2. The Night of Integration. 8,000 characters remaining. Sleep did not come easily that night, not because of anxiety, but because of the fullness of his heart. Eliam lay on his mat in the crowded room of the inn, listening to the breathing of other pilgrims, the distant sounds of the city, the whisper of wind through the streets. His mind was alive with all he had experienced, all he had come to understand. He thought about the old man who had given him the scroll, and he wondered if that encounter had been merely chance or something more. In Hebrew thought, there was no such thing as mere chance. Everything was providence, every meeting ordained, every moment charged with potential meaning. That old man had appeared exactly when Eliam needed him, had spoken exactly the words his soul was hungry to hear, had given him exactly the gift that would guide him on this journey. Perhaps he had been an angel, or perhaps he had simply been what every believer was called to be, a messenger of hope, a bearer of light, a living reminder that God was still at work in the world. As the night deepened, Eliam's thoughts turned to his family. He wondered how they were, whether the enemy had reached Bethlehem yet, whether they were safe or had been forced to flee. The not knowing was difficult, but he realized now that there was a strange peace even in the uncertainty. He had done what he felt called to do. He had made the pilgrimage. He had sought God's face, and now he had to trust that God, who had been faithful to him, would be faithful to his loved ones as well. He thought about his father, that quiet man of Scripture who had spent his life copying sacred texts. How many times had Tobias written out this very psalm, his careful fingers forming each letter with precision? And yet, Eliam suspected his father might never have experienced it the way Eliam had experienced it today. There was a difference between knowing about God and knowing God, a difference between understanding words and living their truth. Eliam had been given a gift, and he felt a responsibility to share it, to help others discover not just the words of Scripture, but the reality behind the words. He thought about his mother, whose faith was simpler but no less real. She did not study Torah like his father. She could barely read, but she knew how to pray, how to trust, how to keep a home filled with love even when resources were scarce. Her faith was practical, worked out in daily acts of service and sacrifice. Eliam realized that both kinds of faith were needed, his father's scholarly devotion and his mother's lived faithfulness. And perhaps his own faith would be a bridge between the two, grounded in Scripture, but expressed in experience. He thought about Hannah, his little sister with her quick mind and curious questions. What would become of her in these troubled times? Would she have the chance to grow up, to marry, to have children of her own? Or would the violence of war steal her future? The thought brought a fresh wave of fear, but Eliam breathed through it, returning again to the words of the psalm. God saw Hannah. God loved Hannah. God would be faithful to Hannah, whatever the future held. Somewhere in the early morning hours, Eliam finally drifted into sleep. But even in sleep, his mind continued to process, to integrate, to weave together all the threads of understanding into a new pattern of being. He dreamed of light breaking into darkness, of water flowing in desert places, of a voice calling his name with infinite tenderness. When he woke, it was to the sound of the shofar, the ram's horn, calling the faithful to morning prayer. He rose quickly, splashing water on his face from the basin provided, and made his way back to the temple. The city was just beginning to wake, shopkeepers opening their stalls, bakers pulling fresh bread from ovens, the smell of morning mingling with the cool air. The temple was less crowded at this early hour, and Eliam found he could move more freely, could find quiet spaces for contemplation. He spent the morning simply being present, walking slowly through the courts, observing the rituals, listening to the prayers, absorbing the atmosphere of this place where heaven and earth met. He saw an old priest teaching a young boy the proper way to present an offering, the patience in the old man's voice, the concentration on the child's face. He saw a woman standing alone, tears streaming down her face as she prayed, her lips moving silently, her hands raised. He saw a group of men engaged in animated discussion of Torah, their voices passionate but respectful, seeking truth together. Each scene was a small window into the life of faith, a reminder that he was part of something larger than himself, a community stretching across space and time. Mid-morning, Eliam found himself drawn to a particular spot in the court of the Israelites, a place where the view opened onto the holy place itself. He could not enter that sacred space. Only priests could go there. But he could see the entrance, could see the smoke of incense rising, could sense the proximity of the divine presence. He stood there for a long time, not thinking, not even really praying, just being present, open, available. And in that stillness, something shifted. It was not dramatic. There was no voice from heaven, no vision, no miraculous sign. But there was a quiet certainty that settled into his heart, a knowing that transcended knowledge. He understood in a way he could not have explained that everything was going to be all right. Not that everything would turn out the way he wanted, not that there would be no suffering or loss, but that ultimately, in the deepest sense, all would be well. Because God was good and God was faithful, and God's purposes could not be thwarted by human evil or earthly catastrophe. The understanding brought such peace that Eliam felt his knees weaken. He sat down slowly, his back against a pillar, and let the peace wash over him. This was what the psalm meant when it spoke of dwelling in the house of the Lord, not just being physically present in the temple, but living in this awareness, this constant consciousness of God's presence and faithfulness. This was what it meant to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, to perceive His character, His nature, His heart toward His people. Chapter 3, The Living Testimony, 7,000 characters. As the day progressed, Eliam became aware of a growing desire to do something, to respond somehow to all he had received. He thought about the offerings being made around him, the sacrifices of animals and grain and wine. These were good and proper, commanded by God Himself. But Eliam sensed that God was asking something different of him. Not the sacrifice of things, but the sacrifice of self. Not the offering of possessions, but the offering of his whole life. He made his way to the outer court and found a quiet corner where he could pray without distraction. And there, in the shadow of the temple walls, he made his offering. He offered his fear, laying it down like a lamb on an altar, releasing his grip on the illusion of control. He offered his future, opening his hands and letting go of his plans and expectations, surrendering to whatever God might have in store. He offered his family, trusting them to the care of the one who loved them infinitely more than he ever could. He offered his very life, willing to live it or lose it according to God's purposes. It was the most costly sacrifice he had ever made, because it required giving up the one thing humans cling to most desperately, the illusion that we are in charge of our own destinies. But as he made the offering, he felt a freedom he had never known before. The burden of trying to control everything, to keep everyone safe, to manage all the variables of life, it was too heavy to carry, and he had never been meant to carry it. He had been meant to trust, to follow, to walk in faith one step at a time. When he finally stood, his legs were stiff from kneeling, but his heart was light. He looked around the temple courts with new eyes, seeing the beauty of it all, the architecture that pointed toward God, the rituals that told the story of redemption, the people who came seeking and finding, asking and receiving, knocking and having doors opened. He spent the rest of that day in the temple, but his mode had shifted from seeking to celebrating. He joined in the singing when psalms were raised. He bowed in worship when prayers were offered. He smiled at children who ran past, chasing each other in innocent play. He spoke kindly to fellow pilgrims who asked directions or sought recommendations. He was no longer a seeker, but a finder, and the difference was evident in his bearing, in his eyes, in the peace that emanated from him. As evening approached again, Eliam knew it was time to leave Jerusalem, to return to Bethlehem and face whatever awaited him there. The pilgrimage had served its purpose. He had sought God's face, and he had found it, or rather, he had discovered that God's face had been seeking him all along. He had come looking for answers, and he had found something better, presence. He had come hoping for deliverance from his circumstances, and he had found deliverance in his circumstances. Before leaving the temple for the final time, Eliam made his way to the place where scribes worked, copying scriptures for pilgrims who wanted to take a portion of God's word home with them. He spent nearly all the money he had left to purchase a fresh copy of Psalm 27, newly written, the ink still dark. and clear. He would keep the old man's scroll as a treasure, a memorial of that providential meeting. But this new scroll he would use, would carry with him, would share with others. It would be his tool for ministry, his way of passing on what he had received. As he made his way out of the temple complex, he paused at the gate and turned back for one last look. The evening sacrifice was being prepared, and soon the smoke would rise again, carrying prayers heavenward. The sun was setting, painting the temple stones in shades of gold and rose, making them glow as if lit from within. It was achingly beautiful, and Eliam committed the image to memory, knowing he might never see it again. If the enemy reached Jerusalem, this building might be destroyed, but the God who dwelt beyond the building could never be destroyed. The temple might fall, but the truth it represented would endure forever. "Thank you," Eliam whispered, not sure if he was speaking to God or to the temple itself or to the city or to some combination of all three. "Thank you for this gift. I will carry it with me. I will share it with others. I will live it all my days." And then he turned and walked out into the city, ready to begin the journey home. Part 4. The Return, 10,000 characters. Chapter 1. The Road Home, 3,500 characters. The journey back to Bethlehem should have felt familiar, but everything had changed. Eliam walked the same roads he had traveled just days before, saw the same landmarks, passed through the same villages. But he was not the same person who had made the journey north. Something fundamental had shifted within him, and the world looked different through his transformed eyes. The refugees were still fleeing north, and Eliam still moved against the flow, heading south toward danger rather than away from it. But now, when people warned him, when they called him foolish, when they asked why he would go toward the enemy, he had an answer. Not a complicated theological explanation, but a simple truth. I must return to my family, and wherever I am, God is with me. Some still thought him mad, but others, perhaps sensing the peace that surrounded him, looked at him with something like envy or hope. One old woman caught his arm and said, "Pray for us, young one. Pray that some of us make it through this storm." And Eliam promised he would, knowing now that prayer was not a futile exercise, but a real force, a way of partnering with God and his work in the world. He walked with purpose, but without hurry, trusting that he would arrive at the right time, whatever that time might be. The anxiety that had plagued him on the journey north was gone, replaced by a settled confidence that had nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with trust. Yes, he might arrive to find Bethlehem already fallen. Yes, his family might already be scattered or worse. Yes, he might walk straight into danger. But none of these possibilities shook the foundation of his peace, because that foundation was no longer built on hoped-for outcomes, but on the character of God. As he walked, he practiced what he would say to his family, how he would try to explain what had happened to him. But words felt inadequate. How could he describe the indescribable? How could he convey the weight and beauty and terror and comfort of encountering the living God? Perhaps he would not try to explain at all. Perhaps he would simply live differently and let them see the change and answer questions as they arose. He spent one night in the same village where he had stayed on the journey north, and the elderly woman who had housed him before welcomed him back. "You look different," she observed as she served him bread and olives. "Lighter, somehow, as if you laid down a burden in Jerusalem." "I did," Eliam agreed. "Many burdens. And I picked up something better, a trust I did not have before." They talked late into the night, and Eliam found himself sharing bits and pieces of his experience, not trying to convince or convert, but simply testifying to what he had seen and felt and come to understand. The woman listened with tears in her eyes, and when they finally parted for sleep, she blessed him with words from the ancient blessing. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you. The next morning, Eliam woke early and continued his journey. By midday, he could see the hills surrounding Bethlehem in the distance. His heart beat faster, not from fear now, but from anticipation. He was almost home, almost back to the people he loved, almost ready to share what he had found, to be a bearer of light in whatever darkness awaited. As he drew nearer, he saw smoke rising from cooking fires, a sign that the village still stood, still functioned, still lived. Relief washed through him, though he tempered it with caution. The village might be intact for now, but that did not mean danger had passed. Still, it was something, a gift, a mercy. He climbed the final hill as the sun began its descent, and then he was there, walking through the familiar streets, seeing familiar faces, hearing familiar voices. People looked at him with surprise. They had not expected him to return, or perhaps had not expected anyone to return from Jerusalem in these uncertain times. "Eliam," a voice called, and he turned to see his friend Daniel, another young shepherd, running toward him. "You're back. We weren't sure." "I am back," Eliam said simply, gripping his friend's arm in greeting. "How is my family? Is everyone well?" "They are well," Daniel assured him. "Worried about you, but well. The enemy has not yet reached us, though they draw nearer each day. Some families have fled. Others have decided to stay and trust in God's protection. Your father has been leading prayers morning and night, asking for deliverance." Eliam smiled. Of course his father would respond to crisis with prayer. It was who he was. "Take me to them," he said. "I have much to tell." Chapter 2. Homecoming and Recognition. 3,500 characters. His mother saw him first. She was outside their home, grinding grain as she did every day, her movements automatic from years of practice. But when she looked up and saw her son walking toward her, the grinding stone fell from her hands and clattered on the stones below. "Eliam!" she cried and ran to him, her dignity forgotten in the rush of relief and joy. She threw her arms around him, holding him tight, and he felt her tears soaking into his robe. My son, you came back to us. I promised I would try," he said softly, holding her just as tightly. And God was faithful. His father emerged from the house, moving more slowly but with no less emotion. Tobias embraced his son, his scribe's hand strong despite their gentle calling. "You look different," he said, echoing the observation of the old woman. "Something has changed." "Everything has changed," Eliam said, "and nothing has changed. I am still your son, but I have understood." He struggled for words, then gave up. "Come, sit with me. Let me tell you everything." Hannah came running from wherever she had been playing, shrieking his name with the unself-conscious joy of childhood. She crashed into him, nearly knocking him over, chattering a mile a minute about everything that had happened while he was gone. He laughed and picked her up, spinning her around, grateful beyond words that she was safe, that they were all safe, at least for this moment. They gathered in their home as evening fell, and Eliam told them everything about the journey, about the temple, about the understanding that had come to him, about the sacrifice he had made, offering his whole life to God's purposes, about the peace that now filled him, a peace that did not depend on circumstances. His father listened with the intense focus of a scholar, occasionally asking clarifying questions. His mother listened with her heart, tears flowing freely at the beauty of it all. Hannah listened with a child's wonder, her eyes wide and shining. When he finished, there was a long silence. Then his father spoke. "You have been given a great gift, my son, and with great gifts come great responsibilities. You must steward this well. You must share what you have learned, but with humility. You must live what you have discovered, but without pride. You must carry this light, but remember that it is not your light. It comes from God and belongs to God." "I know, Father," Eliam said, "or at least I am beginning to know. I have much to learn still. But yes, I want to share this. I want others to understand what I have come to understand, that God is faithful, that He is present even in our darkest moments, that trust is possible even when circumstances are impossible." His mother reached out and took his hand. "You will have opportunity soon enough," she said quietly. "The enemy draws near. Fear grows stronger each day. People are desperate for hope, for something to hold on to. Your words, your testimony may be exactly what some need to hear." And so it proved. In the days that followed, as tension in the village mounted, as more refugees passed through with ever more dire reports, as the reality of approaching danger became undeniable, Eliam found himself sought out by others. Young people his own age who were terrified, parents worried about their children, elders who had lived through much but never anything quite like this. To each, Eliam offered not false comfort or empty promises, but the truth of his experience. He shared the psalm that had guided him, reading it slowly, explaining how each verse had come alive for him. He talked about the choice to trust, about how trust was not a feeling, but a decision made again and again. He spoke of God's presence, not as an abstract theological concept, but as a lived reality. And something remarkable began to happen. People who heard him did not necessarily lose their fear. The circumstances were too dire for that, but they found something stronger than fear. They found faith. They found community. They found a determination to face whatever came, not with denial or despair, but with trust. Chapter 3, Living the Truth, 2,500 characters. The enemy arrived on a Thursday morning, their advance scouts appearing on the ridges around Bethlehem like birds of prey circling before the strike. The village had perhaps 2 days, maybe 3, before the full force arrived. The time of decision had come. The elders gathered to decide what to do. Some still argued for flight, others for negotiation, a few brave souls for resistance. Though everyone knew the village had no real means of defense, the argument went in circles, fear driving people to defensiveness and anger. Then Eliam stood. He was young, barely considered an adult by village standards, but something in his bearing commanded attention. "Elders, fathers, brothers," he said, his voice calm and clear, "we can flee, and perhaps that is wisdom. We can negotiate, and perhaps that will bring mercy. We can fight, and perhaps that is courage. But whatever we decide to do, let us do it from a place of trust, not terror. Let us remember who we are and whose we are. Let us remember that the Lord is our light and our salvation, our stronghold in times of trouble. Whether we live or die, whether we lose everything or somehow preserve it, let us face what comes knowing that we are held by hands that will not let us go." He pulled out the scroll, the new copy of the psalm he had purchased in Jerusalem, and he read it aloud. His voice carried in the stillness, each word weighted with the authority of lived experience. By the time he finished, there was not a dry eye in the gathering. Even the most cynical among them, the ones who had long since given up on faith, felt something stir in their hearts. "We will trust God," the eldest of the elders finally said, his voice shaking with emotion. "And we will also act with wisdom. Families with small children will flee north, giving them the best chance of survival. Those who remain will hide what supplies we can in the caves, protecting what might be needed to rebuild. And we will pray. Morning and night, we will pray, asking God for deliverance, but also for strength to endure whatever comes. It was a plan born not of confidence in tactics, but of trust in God. And somehow, that made all the difference. The panic that had gripped the village began to ease, replaced not with false optimism, but with settled purpose. People knew what to do. They had direction, and underneath it all was the foundation of faith, strengthened by one young shepherd's testimony of encountering the living God. Chapter 4, Full Circle and Eternal Rest, 1,500 characters. In the end, the enemy never reached Bethlehem. Their army was defeated 3 days' march to the south by a coalition of neighboring kingdoms who had finally roused themselves to action. The news came like a miracle, spreading through the region like wildfire, bringing weeping and celebration, relief and gratitude. But Eliam knew the truth. The miracle was not that they had been spared, though he was grateful beyond words. The miracle was what had happened in his heart, in the hearts of his neighbors, in the soul of his community. They had faced their fear and found something stronger. They had stood on the edge of disaster and discovered that the foundation beneath them was solid. They had learned that God was faithful not just in deliverance, but in the waiting, not just in the happy ending, but in the terrible middle. The psalm had become part of him now, woven into the fabric of his being. He lived it every day, working with his sheep, helping his father with his copying, teaching anyone who would listen. The scroll became his most treasured possession, worn from constant use, carried everywhere, shared freely. Years later, when Eliam was an old man himself, with grandchildren at his feet, he would still tell the story of his journey to Jerusalem, of the encounter that changed everything, of the peace that surpassed understanding. And always, he would end the same way, reciting the psalm in full, his aged voice steady with the confidence of a lifetime of trust. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the stronghold of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid? And his listeners would be blessed and comforted and challenged and changed, just as he had been, just as the psalm intended, just as God, in his infinite faithfulness, had always planned. Now, dear listener, may you too find rest in these truths. May you discover that God is your light in every darkness, your stronghold in every storm. May you learn to trust not in circumstances, but in the one who holds all circumstances in his hands. And may you sleep tonight wrapped in the peace that comes from knowing you are loved, you are held, you are never, ever alone. Rest now. Rest well. Rest in the presence of the God who neither slumbers nor sleeps, but watches over you with tenderness beyond measure. Shalom, peace, blessed rest.